I think we are live.
All right, welcome to Medieval Times. Our last installment, technically, of Medieval Times. We're going to finish up in a way looking at the Middle Ages tonight, and next week, Lord willing, we'll begin on the Renaissance, which technically is in the Middle Ages, but there's kind of that transition away from everything about the Middle Ages as we get to the Renaissance. Depending, different historians divide it up differently, but anyway, that's how we're just gonna designate the Renaissance as a separate era altogether, or Renaissance and Reformation probably, and then following that, most people designate as modern times. Believe it or not, the 1500s begins modern times. We are technically postmodern today. I don't know what you do after postmodern. Postmodern, I guess.
When did postmodern start?
It depends on the historian. I think some would say the 60s even. I know that some consider a new era began with the assassination of President Kennedy. That kind of, there's a new, whatever you call it, because after that we have a lot of changes taking place in the United States.
Going south.
Pardon me?
That's a lot of changes that went south.
Yeah, a lot of bad changes and some good changes.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, okay, so tonight I think you'll find it interesting, even though none of you were interested last week in pursuing what happened to Spain, but we're going to do it anyway. And I think you'll find it somewhat interesting. And then we're going to included in that is Portugal. We'll look briefly at the situation in Italy and Germany, because as you remember, we have seen how France and England especially have coagulated together as separate nations, not together, but separately as separate nations. So we have those nations coming more into line with a modern nation state, and we'll see what happens to these other countries. And then I'll finish up by looking at what happens to the papacy after the Great Schism, when you've got 2 popes and 3 popes, and what happened after that. And you'll see all of this leading toward Renaissance and Reformation. All right, we all set? All right, let's pray. Thank you, Father, for this time we can have together. Thank you for all those that are coming out and are interested in what you are doing in history. And we thank you that we can have confidence that you have a plan and you are enforcing that plan. You are bringing about your plan, whether it is the plan related to nations or even to individuals. We're thankful that we can trust you, that you are in control. And may we learn lessons from what we look at tonight that will help us even today as we look at our country and the world and even our own lives. We ask that in all these things that you would be glorified through your Son, Jesus. In his name we pray, amen. All right, so we're looking at Europe after the time of the Great Plague, the Great Schism, all kinds of things that were occurring in the 13th and 14th centuries and 15th centuries. So this is generally how Europe looks as we are coming to the end of the Middle Ages. You can see, I know, well, this is just Northern Europe. You can see there's the Kingdom of England, and there's France. Remember, England in the 100 Years' War ended up losing almost all of their French possessions, except for Aquitaine, which is down there. We have the Kingdom of Scotland. It's not yet united with England. Ireland is divided up into different smaller kingdoms. And then we look over here and we see that it's kind of a mess, just all kinds of different geographical, political areas where there's a king or a duke, somebody in charge there. And then you can see up here, this Kingdom of Denmark, Kingdom of Sweden, and Kingdom of Norway. So some of these places have coalesced, the people of some of these areas have coalesced into nations, and others have not. And so we're going to look at what happens with one of them, because it's so important in relationship to what's happening religiously. So this is the Reconquista in Spain. Reconquista is the reconquering in Spain. The nations on the Iberian Peninsula, which is not shown on that map, Iberian Peninsula is where we know today is Spain and Portugal. That's called the Iberian Peninsula, separated from France by the Pyrenees Mountains. And the Iberian Peninsula was an area that had been conquered, reconquered by a number of different peoples. And we think back to, remember the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. Carthage had colonies there. Rome had control over some of those from time to time. Different peoples had come in. There never really was a Spain per se prior to those times. There were just towns and villages and some cities maybe of small dukedoms or small areas of where there were political authority, but not a country per se. And so the nations on the Iberian Peninsula developed much later than those in the rest of Europe. If you look at this, see the reconquest then of Spain. Oh, I should mention that the reason it needs to be reconquered is because there were Muslims that came over across from Africa. By this time, the Muslims had taken control of all of northern Africa as well as the Middle East. And I didn't think to have a map of that to show you. As you think about over in the Middle East and going north up into what is called Turkey today, but Asia then, and over to Constantinople, that city that had been established by Constantine the Great. They took that, renamed it Istanbul. And so the Muslims have spread rapidly and viciously through all of that area. And being that Africa is so close to Spain, across the Mediterranean there, they went across that water and established themselves in the Iberian Peninsula as well, and eventually took over almost all of it. So beginning in the middle of the 8th century AD, which would be the 700s, there was an effort on behalf of those that were not yet conquered or had not been conquered by the Muslims, which are called Moors, to retake some of the land that had been lost. This effort lasted 3 centuries. The driving forces were, first of all, religion, because those that were seeking to reconquer were Christian, Roman Catholic, and of course the Muslims were the ones in charge of the majority of the peninsula. There were several different geographical, political, mostly political areas that arose that gained strength enough to fight against the Moors. Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Portugal. I'm sure you've heard of at least most of those. There were some times when there was peace, but so over 3 centuries, there's an attempt to reconquer. So this is how it's going to look eventually, but we'll go back to what it looked like as it's just getting started in a moment. So a large part of the delay in reconquering was due to the Muslim domination following their invasion in 7/11. So it'd be easy to remember, it's 7/11, open all night, the Moors invaded the Iberian Peninsula. And they control most of the peninsula. So this is what it's going to look like as those areas of Castile and Aragon, particularly in Portugal, reconquer that territory. This is what it looks like in 747. 747, you can see where France is there, and the border between France and the Iberian Peninsula is the Pyrenees Mountains. At that time, there was only Asturias, was the only part of the peninsula that was not controlled by the Moors.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
Is there any way we get the
Yeah.
TV on?
Is that hard to do?
TV's not.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about
Sorry.
If you recall, if you were here when we talked about the beginnings and spread of Islam or the Muslim religion, you might, it might sound familiar for this to be called the Umayyad Caliphate. That was one of the major divisions within Islam that conquered territory, the Umayyad Caliphate. All right, so that's in 747. So very little of the peninsula is not controlled by the Muslims. And as you will remember, if you have been with us, there was an effort to invade France. Does anybody remember what happened when the Muslims or the Moors invaded France? That was about this time. The Battle of Tours, in which the Muslims were defeated by
The croissants.
Croissants. No, now my mind's wiped out. You got me thinking food now. Charles Martel. Remember Charles Martel? His son was Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Charles Martel defeated them at the Battle of Tours, and they turned around, went back across the Pyrenees, and didn't return until the present century, which now they have invaded France once again, only this time not with weapons, but with sheer numbers. And within a brief period, relatively brief period of time, the Muslims in France are going to outnumber those that used to be of a Christian heritage that are no longer Christian. And so they will take over by attrition, I guess you could say. All right, so that's 747. As we go to, whoops, I went backwards. No, that's right. So 750 is next, yeah. If I know my numbers. So the Carolingian Empire is France, and the Kingdom of Asturias has lost ground at this point to the Umayyad Caliphate, but they're starting to push back. And so by 1100, that's 750 to 1100 is what, 350 years? So that's a long time. That's longer than our nation's been in existence. But through constant efforts and the establishment of some different kingdoms there, kingdoms of Barcelona, Aragon, and Navarre, and Leon Castile, they've been able to take back much of the territory of the northern peninsula. And this is, I couldn't get a year on this, but it's somewhere close to, I think this might be around 1200. We can see the division is very similar. The only difference is that over in the west, instead of Leon Castile, you have Leon, Galicia, and then Portugal as a separate area. What happens eventually is that the governor of Portugal, when it comes time for these other kingdoms, I guess we'll call them, to band together, decides that they're going to remain separate. So that's how Portugal gets to be a separate country from Spain. Now, by the time we get to 1299, the Christians have driven out the Moors except for Granada. So, and that period of time from, say, 750 to 1299. So what's that, six or 700 years it took to drive them out little by little. So let's see. Yeah, now from the northern states, then, as we've been saying, three main kingdoms developed, taking over the lands that the Moors had vacated. This again shows you the progression, little by little, from 1000 to 1250 to 1492, and the present day borders are on there as well. The three kingdoms that developed were Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. Go back to here. Those are the three northern states. So what is not in those three gets assimilated in over the time. Through the struggles of moving toward monarchy, the equivalent of a parliament developed in each of them called the Cortes, C-O-R-T-E-S. This is like their parliament or council, and it was comprised of nobles, clergy, and representatives of the cities. So they're developing a representative government, just similar, very similar, I should say, at least to France and England at the time as well. The expulsion of the Moors, together with the support from the growing towns and the decline of feudalism, increased the power of each king above that of his feudal nobles and Cortes. So in other words, just as in France and England and other areas of Europe, the kings are developing more and more power over the nobles, especially because the nobles are losing power due to feudalism disintegrating, but also the Cortes. The merging of Castile and Aragon, go back to here again, those two large areas, Castile and Aragon, actually form the nation of Spain. This was accomplished, this merger of the two, by the marriage in 1469 of the heirs of each, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. They weren't the monarch yet, but they were the heirs to the monarch. So they were prince and princess, if you will, and they married in order to bring those two together to form one nation in the Iberian Peninsula, except for Portugal, the nation of Spain. Okay, any questions to this point? Does Ferdinand and Isabella sound familiar? Good. 10 years later, when they had ascended on their respective thrones, they're married, but they finally inherit their thrones, they began acting as a united Spain. Moors in the south had been reduced to paying annual tribute, reversing what had been the situation for several hundred years when Christians on the peninsula paid annual tribute to the Moors. So now the Moors are paying tribute to the Christian rulers. However, in 1478, Abul Hassan, the new king of Granada, refused to pay the tribute. Doesn't always happen that way. Pressed for it by Spanish ambassadors, he replied that in the same place where coins were minted in Granada, swords were also forged to prevent those coins from being taken. Ferdinand and Isabella prepared for war. Abul Hassan struck first with a surprise attack on the fortress town of Zahara in 1481, the night after Christmas. The Spanish immediately fortified all their remaining border towns. Many Moors became afraid, realizing they had awakened a sleeping giant in the newly united Christian kingdoms. One old counselor was said to have exclaimed, "Woe is me! The ruins of Zahara will fall on our heads. The days of the Muslim Empire in Spain are numbered." Largely through the efforts of Ponce de Leon. You recognize that name? Okay, with what do you associate Ponce de Leon? Fond of youth in, right, he named it Florida, which means flowers. This is what he was before he became an explorer. He was a captain. And he was able to conquer the natural forces of Alhama, which lay about 24 miles north of Granada, opening the rest of the area to a slow conquest by Ferdinand over the next 10 years. Slow conquest. It takes 10 years to conquer that whole area. Going after Granada, the main city. Granada finally capitulated on January 2nd, 1492. And the Christian troops mounted a silver cross on a high building and raised their monarch's flag. Out of gratitude for God's goodness, Isabella became receptive to the idea of being pitched by an Italian of sailing west to get to Asia rather than going around Africa as the Portuguese were doing, with at least with the prospect of riches, but also some might even say the predominant idea in taking the gospel to these Asians, to the Chinese and the Indians of Asia. So she financed it. Legend says she sold her jewels in order to finance the purchasing of 3 ships that this Italian by the name of Cristobal Colon would use in order to sail west to the east and hopefully open the doors of commerce between India and China with Spain. They finally realized the expulsion of the Moors entirely, completing the Reconquista in 1502. So here are the stages. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but those numbers, but that's how it begins, and then moves on left to right, I believe, and then the bottom, 13th century, and then bottom right is the 15th century, where they conquered all but that small area, which they then are able to complete by 1502. All right, so that is the Reconquista of Spain. Any comments or questions? Well, and you can see where this is, I mean, it's really remarkable to think that a nation which was not a nation becomes a nation, driving out the Moors by a couple of kingdoms banding together through marriage. And they become then, through the explorations that they finance, to what with Columbus is the discovery of a new world, not the world they thought they were going to, but a new world. And Spain becomes the wealthiest nation in Europe, maybe even in the world at the time. So they go quickly from not being a nation to being the wealthiest, the most powerful nation with the strongest navy in the world as well. As just a side note to get you thinking, especially since the Chinese abolished their navy in 1420, I believe it was, or 1422, something like that. A navy which had sailed around the world. Maybe we'll get to that someday. Okay. No more questions about that. Let's move on to Italy and Germany. This is a look at 14th century Europe. So, again, you can see Castile and Aragon, two separate kingdoms fighting against the Moors, driving down to Granada. Here you see France, but the area of Aquitaine and Gascony still being controlled by England. And that will change by the early part of the 16th century. This will become smaller, what England controls. This is the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany plus. Now, the Holy Roman Empire is ruled by the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Emperor. But within his empire, there are lots of smaller kingdoms, or at least duchies, that have their own rulers, and he's supposed to be the ruler of them all, but it's not really a country. An empire is, by definition, rule over a bunch of countries, and so this is not divided up. I think we'll see another map that will show it divided up, and you see Poland and Hungary, Bosnia, the Serbian states as well, and you also see that Italy is divided up into several different nations, if you will. Let's look at Italy more particularly. In the wake of nationalism and the creation of nation states, Germany and Italy remained divided into many small regional states. Therefore, to refer to Germany or Italy was to reference a geographical area, not a country. Today, we consider it the same. When we talk about Germany, we're talking about a country, but also a geographical area. Talk about Italy, we're talking about a country that is geographical area and a political area. But that wasn't so at this particular time, at the end of the Middle Ages. The Italian states included the Kingdom of Naples. You see Naples on there?
Yes,
Cool.
go green.
Right down here. And hopefully everything on my list is on there. The Papal States. The Papal States go from one coast to the other, running through Rome. And powerful northern cities such as Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Milan. National unity was not possible as each state continued to compete for control. So there's rivalry between the different states, and more than the ones I mentioned. There are smaller ones that are all trying to maintain their own identity and sometimes vying for control over the others. So there's no unity there. Although they're technically, there's another close-up of the more important states of Italy. And in fact, it won't be until the early 1800s that both Germany and Italy will become unified. So that's, 200 or 300 years at least before that happens. Way behind France, England, and so on. So technically, they're going on to Germany now. There was an emperor, as I said, who ruled over the German states, but he lacked real power. A written constitution called the Golden Bull established the equivalent of a parliament that was called the Diet, we would say, or Diet of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, remember that, this word diet, because that's going to come into play later. There's a lot of things that we're looking at right now that are going to have an effect on the things that we're really pointing toward, particularly the Reformation. The most important members of the Diet were the 7 electors, 3 archbishops, and 4 noble princes, who selected the German emperors. The electors generally chose weak men as emperors in order to protect the power of the German nobility. In addition, they passed the imperial crown from one family to another so that no single family would become too powerful. You can see the wisdom in that. All right, so that's how Germany is divided up and how they remain divided and remain in control of their own areas and keeping the emperor from having too much power. You look over that map, you see any areas that look familiar or sound familiar? You might recognize this name. Does that ring a bell to anybody? The people that come from there are called Hessians. Where have you encountered Hessians? Yeah. They were hired by the King of England to come over and fight because he didn't have enough troops to fight against the American colonists. So these are German soldiers that came to America to fight against the those that were vying for independence. That's where they come from. And the prince of this area hired out these soldiers. He was paid by his relative, King of England, in order to send them. The troops didn't get anything more. So technically they're not mercenaries because they're not being paid themselves. They're just going wherever the prince tells them. The prince is being paid. Also familiar? Brandon?
Yeah.
No, there, okay, yeah, I've been finding Brandenburg, yeah, there's a gate in Berlin called the Brandenburg Gate. Presumably empty out into Brandenburg. Remember the city of Bremen? What? Yeah, musicians of Bremen. Yeah, what was that? What was that story? Anybody else remember that? The musicians of Bremen. It's an old folk story, and I don't remember how it goes either. There's Hamburg, where we get hamburgers.
Germany's great that way. So if you live in Hamburg, you're a hamburger.
Yeah.
If you live in Frankfurt, you're a Frankfurter.
And if you live in Berlin and you're a Berliner, you're a donut. That's the name of donuts there. Someone joked that when John F. Kennedy was there and said, and I can't remember the German words. Yeah, that he was actually saying I'm a donut. I've been told by a German person that they wouldn't have understood it that way. They would have understood what you're saying. Baden. So there was a concentration camp down here. I think what was the word? Baden something. Here's the Rhineland. That area that was taken away from Germany after World War I, given to France, or at least they were keeping it demilitarized. When Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, that was an act of aggression. Let's see, Wittenberg. Wittenberg is in the north or somewhere, but I'm not sure exactly where.
Old East Germany.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, it's all divided up. One family was able to counteract the desire for disunity by gaining control in the southern states, and they're called the Habsburgs or Habsburg. I've seen it spelled with a P or a B, and I'm not sure if this is the English spelling of dynasty, a dynasty, or not. We would spell it with a Y. The nation that developed from these states was Austria. So the Habsburgs controlled the southern German states, and that becomes Austria. Emperor Maximilian I greatly enlarged the Habsburg possessions through marriage. His first marriage brought the rich region of the Low Countries, which is modern Belgium and Holland, under his rule. His second marriage brought him Milan, which, as you remember, is in Italy. He also formed a marriage alliance between his son and the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. In this way, Spain, the Low Countries, the Holy Roman Empire, and the territory in the New World, the Spanish possessions, came under Habsburg rule. So through marriage, he was able to gain a lot of control. Unfortunately, after a time, with the marriages remaining within the family, there were some evidences of what do we call it, genetic problems. So there developed the Habsburg jaw that can be attributed to inbreeding. Can you see it there?
Mhm.
And it's even more pronounced in this fellow. I
think the nose also.
Yeah, yeah.
I
And
think that's fetal alcohol syndrome right there. Looks like it. Wide
as
eyes.
unattractive as that is in a male, it's a female.
Excuse me, when you said he had a second marriage, was he divorced from the first one, or there?
No, the first marriage that he engineered, not of himself,
Yes.
of in his family.
Arranged.
Yeah, sorry, the way I said that, it was unclear. And then this is the family tree. It's kind of hard to pick out anybody in particular there, but if you start at the top, you see the Maximilian II married Maria of Spain. Charles V married Isabella of Portugal. Over to the left, you've got Ferdinand, HRE, Holy Roman Emperor, married Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. Below that, Philip I of Castile married Joanna of Castile. Vladislav II of Hungary married Anne of Foy Candel. Philip I of Castile married Joanna of Castile. That's the same as the other. We already had that. Wonder why they're in there twice. So we've got some Portugal marrying Aragon down below. So yeah, this is going on in Europe for quite some time. And so by the time you get to World War I, as some have said, it was really a war between. It was really a family fight because all the royalty of Europe was related to one another. And there was a lot of intermarriage with one another. All right. Any questions about the Habsburgs? I hope not, because I don't know anything more. There's a lot more to know, but I just don't. It's just a very important family that gained a lot of control in Europe. Okay, let's move to, I don't know if I have this in your notes this way, the continued plunge of the papacy. No? What do I have for Roman numeral 6?
We don't have anything, but we got conclusions after the Habsburgs.
Oh, okay, well, this is before the conclusions. So Roman numeral 6, continued plunge of the papacy. You may have thought the papacy would have plunged as far as it could go. We had 2 or 3 popes and a lot of immorality and a lot of illegal and immoral things going on, but it's going to get worse. And so I want to take you through the next few popes, beginning with Innocent the Eighth. So capital A would be Innocent the Eighth, who reigns as Pope from 1484 to 1492. And for some of these, I'm just going to give you some of the highlights or lowlights without going into a lot of detail. Innocent the Eighth became a pope by bribery. So they're not picking the best man for the job. It's whoever is giving the College of Cardinals money or positions. Under him, lawlessness was rampant. He sold cardinal hats. No, not that kind. That was the offices of cardinal, which had a hat involved. Okay, here's the Pope. Remember, here's the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, the supposedly celibate leader of the Roman Catholic Church, who fathered 16 children by married women. And engaged himself in orgies and banquets. Kind of makes his name ironic, doesn't it?
Really?
But he looks so pious in the painting, doesn't he?
I suppose a lot of wine goes along with all that.
I'm sure. I mean, he is Italian too, so. He's followed in that momentous year of 1492. So much happened that year by Pope Alexander VI. He is a de Borgia. Maybe you've heard of the de Borgia family. They were originally from Spain. And when they came to Italy, they adjusted their name from the original Spanish to Borgia. He was born in Spain as Rodrigo de Borgia y Doms and graduated as a doctor of ecclesiastical law from the University of Bologna. Following the election of his uncle as Pope Calixtus III, he was ordained successively as a bishop, cardinal, and then vice chancellor of the church. He served under 4 other pontiffs, amassing immense power and wealth. When Pope Innocent III died in 1492, Rodrigo used an unprecedented show of coercion and corruption to acquire the papal seat against 2 other competitors. It was rumored that Rodrigo bribed one of the other rivals with 4-mile loads of silver. Prior to becoming Pope, Rodrigo evidenced extreme immorality. Now he's a church official, but before he's Pope. In 1460, he participated in an orgy in Siena that was so raunchy that it led to the Pope at the time, Pius II, sending Rodrigo a letter to express his quote-unquote displeasure. The Pope questioned Rodrigo's seemingly constant desire for sensual pleasure and requested that at the very least, he not wear his official religious garb when participating in sex parties.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, it's the least he could do. Moreover, the famed banquet of the chestnuts in 1501 was a family affair. The lavish party featured 50 prostitutes picking up chestnuts not with their hands, in front of high nobles, church officials, and other chosen guests. What started as a dinner party quickly turned into an all-night orgy with prizes awarded for the best demonstrations of sexual prowess. Now, this is after he split. Alexander VI is considered by most to be the most corrupt pope of the Renaissance period. Although he did enact some needed reforms, or at least he promised to. He, within a year, forgot about reform as he went back to his normal debauchery. He fathered numerous children by many mistresses, some of whom he appointed to church offices, not the mistresses, the children. It's suspected that his firstborn son, whom he had appointed a bishop, murdered another son who was his favorite in 1497. His most important mistress was Venosa del Catanei, who continued the relationship through 3 marriages prior to his becoming pope, producing 4 children. So he insisted on that because then it wouldn't be obvious that he was the father of the children because she's married. After he became pope, he became disinterested in her and took on another mistress. And I won't go into, her and the other ones. Charles VII of France invaded and sacked Rome and dominated Alexander. When this happened, the Pope appealed not to God, but to the Sultan of Turkey for assistance. So he appealed to the Muslims for help. Eventually, he forced an alliance with Venice, Milan, and the Holy Roman Emperor to drive the French out of Italy. One of his notable acts was the executing of William Savonarola, who was preaching the gospel in Florence and criticizing the Pope for his evil acts. For that, he was promised safe conduct to the Council of Constance, at which time he was arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and eventually killed. I believe he was, we'll talk more about him later when we get to the pre-reformers and reformers. I believe he was strangled and then burned. They attempted to keep him alive so he would at least feel the burning. He was a well-known admirer of the arts. He hosted men like Raphael, who painted this painting, I believe, or at least or another one of him, Michelangelo, and others in Rome. One of the things that set Alexander VI apart in papal history of that period is his benign treatment of the people of Jewish faith. He welcomed about 9,000 destitute Iberian Jews into the Papal States after their expulsion from Spain in 1492. That's another reason why that date is important, because in that year, Spain said, all Jews get out. And by the way, you can't take any gold or silver with you. The only choice they had was either to get out or convert to the Christian faith. And even then, the Inquisition was there in order to torture them if it was thought that they were just faking conversion, which some did. So anyway, one of the good things he did is he provided a place for Jews that were kicked out of Spain to live. He died at the age of 72 in Rome, Italy, after a dinner with a cardinal that earlier had been poisoned himself, but lived, and at which he and his firstborn son, Cesare Borgia, both became ill. So this is something that historians can't really figure out for certain. It is thought that this cardinal was poisoned either by Alexander VI or by his son, Cesare, and that at this dinner, the cardinal turned the tables on them and poisoned them. And the son lived, and the Pope Alexander VI later died. It's not known for certain what happened exactly. The son, in the course of his lifetime, earned a reputation for brutality and violence that would eclipse that of his father. When his brother Giovanni died in 1497, it was rumored that Cesare had killed him out of jealousy. The death of Lucretia's second husband, Lucretia is, I think, his sister. I'm not for sure about that. The death of her second husband was also supposedly carried out at the orders or at the very hands of Cesare. This again may have been a jealous act if the rumors about the incestuous relationship with his sister are true. Yeah, that's his sister. So it may have been jealousy. Cesare was feared and hated throughout Italy for his arrogance and affinity for vengeance. Alexander himself may have feared his son by the end of his life. In one of his last evenings with his son, Alexander took ill, again from this poisoning, and soon died. Cesare also got sick, but he survived. Rumors began to spread that Cesare actually poisoned his father, or that they were both seeking to kill that rival cardinal and drank poisoned wine by mistake. This makes ironic this quote from the Pope: "Who are we to trust if not our family?" Other historians assert that Alexander died of malaria or some other stomach ailment. But because Alexander's body was in such horrific condition by the time of his public exhibition, poison rumors continued to swirl. His last words before death were, I'll come. It's normal for you to call me, but wait a bit more." What do you think he meant by that? I mean, if you think he was talking to God, it sounds like God called him from time to time. And he's just telling God, just wait a minute, I'll be there. It's like, call on the phone. I'll be there in a minute. But if he was getting calls, I don't think it was from God. Any other thoughts on that?
He was on the same phone line as Joan of Arc.
Yeah. Yeah. Historians often attribute the subsequent rise of Protestantism to his disregard of the spiritual inheritance of the Catholic Church. And you see it coming. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's going on that people are looking at, even normal people are looking at and saying, this is the Christian church? Something's wrong with all this. And remember, this is just in the 1490s. And the Reformation begins in 1520. That's only 20 some years later that Luther nails the 95 Theses. Am I right? 1517. 20 nailed the 95 Theses. So not very many years after this, but it's going to get possibly worse, at least no better. The next pope is Julius II. Having bribed everyone, Giuliano della Rovere was elected Pope Julius II by one of the shortest conclaves ever. Well, they already, it's all bought and paid for, so it didn't take them long to decide. On the day of his election, Julius II declared that he would not live in the same room that Borgia had lived in, Alexander VI, because of the immorality that had gone on there. So at least he had some scruples. He ordered all the tombs of the Borgias to be opened and the bodies sent to Spain, where the family come from. The Borgia, the Borgia apartments were left sealed until the 19th century. Julius II was a lover of war and a lover of art, commissioning the Sistine Chapel ceiling painted by Michelangelo and rooms in the Vatican decorated by Raphael. This is even reflected in his tomb. This is the tomb of Pope Julius II, produced by Michelangelo. And you've probably seen close-ups of that middle statue of Moses. But here's the whole tomb. When he died, how many of you know who Erasmus was? Heard of Erasmus? He was the father of humanism. He was a great scholar, produced the first Greek New Testament. Almost was a reformer. Couldn't quite make the break. He wrote a tract, supposedly, when Julius II died, entitled Julius Excluded from Heaven. And it's the story of Julius's unsuccessful attempt to get into heaven. So here's the Pope trying to get into heaven and being denied. It's a dialogue written in 1514. Let's see, it involves Pope Julius II, who had recently died, trying to persuade St. Peter to allow him to enter heaven by using the same tactics he applied when alive. The dialogue is also supplemented by a genius, the guardian angel of Julius, who makes wry comments about the Pope and his deeds. I've not read it. I understand it's quite humorous. But can you imagine a tract being written mocking the recently dead Pope and indicating that the vicar of Christ was not going to make it, or had not made it, into heaven? And the successor to Julius II was Leo X, the Pope of the Reformation. But before we go to the Reformation, we're going to back up a little bit and look at the Renaissance. And I don't want to break that up, so we'll wait till next week and look at what happens in the Renaissance. It's almost it is a daunting task to even consider all of the artists. You're familiar with many of them, and considering what was it that drove them? Why had this not happened before? And we're going to talk about the difference between the Southern Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. That is the Southern Europe, primarily Italy, and the Renaissance that took place in Northern Europe were very different in subject matter, how things were painted, sculpted, and so on. So I hope you'll find that interesting.
You're gonna have another paper for that?
Yes. I haven't finished studying it yet. I just finished studying some of this this afternoon. That's why I didn't have an updated outline for you. All right, any comments or questions about what we've seen?
What does that CE mean after the 1500?
That is the modern way of eliminating Jesus from our dating by calling it, instead of calling it AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, they now call it Common Era.
You mean I'm behind the times?
All modern literature
Let's figure
calls it
something else
CE,
to screw it up.
and it's no longer BC, but BCE, before the Common Era, because we can't have Christ or the Lord in our dating.
What are they gonna change our money to?
Well,
Sorry.
yeah, well, they've been trying to do that too. But this was done, this didn't have to go through Congress. This is just academia. They all are doing it, and so everybody falls in place because primarily they're against Christianity. But one of the things that disturbs me is that Christians use it too, and I refuse to. It's on this. I can't do anything about
This
that.
is the
But
first I've seen it. Well, thank you for informing.
yeah. Any other comments or questions?
I think it's just not helpful to think about the popes and all that's going on, so the people knew this. You know, they didn't have internet, they didn't have newspapers, or they didn't have all these other things. But they knew what was going on. And so that's that helps you foment, you know, all the stuff.
And they can see the corruption even locally, their
Yeah,
own priests.
exactly.
Yes,
With all these derelict popes, were the people of the Catholic Church kind of on the same page or what?
well, the people. I mean, there's no other church to go to. It's not like there's corruption in my church, I'll go to another church down the street. There is only one church. So they're kind of stuck with whatever they've got, and they're told that no matter how corrupt the Pope is, that it's the sacraments that get them into heaven. So they still, no matter what the Pope's doing, I still have to go to my local Roman Catholic Church and go to Mass, go to confession, participate in the sacraments in order to save my own soul. So it's very personal. And so if the Pope, no matter how corrupt he is, pronounces an interdict on a country or a political area ruled by a duke, which eliminates mass and Christian burial, the people get upset because that's affecting their own salvation. So they put pressure on their political leader, whether it's a king or whatever, to do what the Pope wants, because otherwise they're going to hell. It's hard for us knowledgeable people today to understand the ignorance and the superstition of the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. But remember, people, even people that could read didn't have a Bible. There's no Bible anywhere that they can access. And if they could find one, it's in Latin. So if they are part of academia, they could possibly read it, but they're not encouraged to do so. In fact, they're discouraged from doing so because the church is to tell you what God wants and what the Bible means. So that's why it's such a breakthrough. And as we'll get to, when Erasmus gathers the manuscripts that he can, the Greek manuscripts that he can, throughout Europe, and puts them together and comes up with a Greek New Testament, because those that are educated are learning not only to read Latin, but to read Greek, so they can read the Greek philosophers. And now they have a Greek New Testament, which would predate their Latin version of the Bible, which was translated by Jerome from Greek and Hebrew texts. But now they can find that some of the things that Jerome translated aren't exactly accurate from the Greek. And so it's one of the things that Luther runs up against. You know, and if it's not for, I mean, all these things band together. Even just the example of Erasmus, if he doesn't come up with a Greek New Testament, faulty as it was, because there's sometimes he didn't have a Greek manuscript for certain passages of scripture. So he simply took the Latin and translated that into Greek. But if it's not for the Greek New Testament, there's no Luther understanding the Word of God as it was written. There's no, you know, Zwingli was a teacher of Greek, and then the Greek New Testament, students were reading the Greek New Testament. All the things that have been happening for us the last few months have been snowballing toward what's going to be a major revolution in the church. It's kind of fun to see it happening, but it's disturbing to see what led to it with these popes, especially.
Part of what you see spiritually too, I think, is a dichotomy between your spiritual life and your regular life. You accept that in your spiritual years, you start to accept that in your own life. And so then the sacraments are now just literally hoops you're just jumping through. There's no.
Yeah.
You're not really engaged in any kind of way of, you know. So you're living your life the way you want to, just like your spiritual leaders are, and you jump through this spiritual, you know, the
Mhm.
religious hoops. And you see that, you know, in any legalistic kind of thing.
It's just like those today that get baptized, whether it's as an infant or as an adult, in order to go to heaven. Thinking that the outward performance of that is what does it. But we know it's not the outward sign, it's what happens inwardly that does that. Any comments? In fact, I just turned on, can you pick up, channel 30 from Sharon Newcastle? It's part of the, Christian television network. They have, I think, 6 different channels, 30-1, 30-2. 30-3 is Grit, which is Westerns, which I go to that. 30-1 is their Christian station, and some of the stuff they got in there is goofy. Actually, at 5 o'clock on Sunday evenings, they have one called Origins, which is addressing creationism, which is really good. It's hosted by Greg Halsapple, who is a pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. He's also on a panel sometimes of pastors that talk about things. But on there this afternoon, I flipped over to see what was going on, and they were playing the movie, which I may show in here, John Wycliffe. And the particular part that I saw, Wycliffe was came across a sheriff, I guess it was, bringing in a criminal, and he's going to hang him for stealing food out of the king's forest or something like that. And I won't go into all the whole discussion there, but eventually it gets down to the guy says, I'm not a great sinner. I've been forgiven. I've got this indulgence that says that my sins are forgiven. So even if you kill me, I'll still go to heaven. And you know, Wycliffe is just aghast. No, that's not it. It's faith in Jesus Christ, not a piece of paper that you can buy. But people believe that because that's what their priest told them. They had what option did they have? Like I said, they have no Bible. The only person that can tell them anything about spiritual things is their priest. And if their priest is ignorant, then that's what they get. They get superstition. So it takes a lot for guys like Luther and others to get the message across. He gets it across to the academic world relatively quickly, and they see the arguments and they see that he's right, but he emphasizes preaching the word as a way to get it to the masses, and that's exactly the way it had to be done. And he did it, and many others did too. And with Wycliffe, he sent out preachers to preach the word. We'll see all that. Getting ahead of myself here. But it's exciting stuff. We'll see what God does to combat all this error and superstition and lawlessness and immorality. Okay, make sure you tune in to Discovering His Story at yctv.org. The latest episodes that I finished were about Assyria, and how many of us know anything about Assyria? I recorded 4 programs on Assyria, and I'm not done yet. That's the nation that eventually takes Israel into captivity. But there's a lot that happens between Assyria, Israel, and Judah over many years before finally God gives them up, gives Israel up, but also saves Judah, Jerusalem. So interesting stuff from this nation. And in the meantime, there's this pause when Assyria is not going out and conquering nations, which is probably when Jonah goes there. And for a generation, Assyria is peaceful because they've repented and come to the Lord. But a generation later, they're back to their old ways. So interesting stuff, even if it's a bit complicated. So check that out on YCTV. I'm not sure what's airing right now, but we'll be coming to that soon, I think. I'm praying for Tom Gregory, the producer of YCTV. He is having surgery this week to donate a kidney to a friend of his who doesn't know the Lord, and he's doing it as a witness to him of how a Christian can care for another guy. So sometime this week, he'll be in one room. I think it's in Pittsburgh, and his friend will be in another, and they'll take his kidney out, or one of his out, and give it to this guy. So he'll be out of commission for a few weeks. All right, no more questions. Hope to come back next week. Exciting stuff, looking at art. Now you say, I don't like art. Hey, you're gonna like this art. We have some artists here that can help out, maybe critique what I'm saying as well. I know Elizabeth can, because she took art history class, covered the Renaissance. And I'm sure Jeff can. Jeff has too. I'm sure.
Yep.
Yes, thank you.